Good. Okay, so everybody gets a warning that it's being recorded. A couple of points. One is that this will last approximately 1 hour. We will be taking questions during this session, but we ask you to, whilst the speaker is speaking, you can ask questions, but you do it via the Q&A box, which is down at the bottom, okay? And at the end, we will read out your questions, myself and my co-host, Elena Barn-Hemsworth. We will read out your questions. And then once we've read out those questions, there will be an opportunity for an open live question session where you will have to raise your hand, and then one of us will manage to unmute you and you'll be able to ask questions. So we are recording this. This is the second session in our new group, the Global Language-Based Area Studies Research Theme or Cluster. And we are extremely honoured today to have a brilliant speaker from law, Professor Ambreena Manji, who is Professor of Law and Development, who also was Director of the British Academy's British Institute in East Africa, who's written a book recently, Struggle for Land and Justice in Kenya, and I'm looking forward to reading that myself, who is a co-founder of the Law and Justice Centre in Cardiff, who's also headed up the Africa Studies Association, and quite frankly is an absolutely brilliant colleague. So because I'm starting late, I think I'm going to hand over almost immediately to Ambreena with one proviso, which is that we do not have simultaneous translation in Welsh because there were not any requests for that. So I'm going to proceed on that basis and hand over to Ambreena and mute my own mic in the process. Okay, Ambreena, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gordon. Thank you very much for the honour of presenting this lecture today, and particularly of launching your new research theme, which I'm looking forward very much to following as the year goes on. I'm going to try today to draw on my own work, particularly in African studies, and those of you who've received an outline to today's lecture just before we began will see that I entitle my talk Decolonising African Studies, although my brief from Gordon was very much to speak more broadly about area studies. And that's for a particular reason that I think that African studies in particular is where I have my expertise, and it's the area of work that I've been concentrating on all of my career and that I know best. And so I'm going to try and draw on some of the experiences that I've had in relation to African studies both in the UK, but also when I'm based in East Africa. So I'll draw on my work as the president of the African Studies Association, which my presidency has just ended this year, on my work running the British Institute in Eastern Africa in Nairobi, but also my work since I've been in Cardiff as one of the founders of the Law and Global Justice Centre. And I'm going to draw in particular substantively on ongoing research I have in the legal framework governing UK aid. And as I give my lecture, the reasons for that will become clear. So I want to start by introducing a little bit about that legal framework governing UK aid and talk about the particular relevance for us as researchers in higher education institutions before I talk about my approach to decolonizing, if we can use that term. I have some reservations about that language, but I'll come on to that in a second. So the first thing to say is that I've become very interested in recent years in the funding streams that many of us will know under the rubric of global challenges. Those of us who research in universities will be by now very familiar with this language. The reason it came about is that there have been in the past 5 years very significant changes in the research landscape. I picked up on this because I was already following very closely the legal framework governing UK ODA or official development assistance more broadly. And my ears pricked up when I started to hear talk of significant investment in what was going to be called a Global Challenges Research Fund. And so I've been tracking that fund right from the start and have been very interested in its impact, and in particular on what it might do in relation to ongoing work on and with Global South scholars. So the question for me was, would this new research funding embed in continuing what we know are existing power differentials between researchers, or would it be a way to challenge those differences in power? And if the latter, then how might that happen? The early signs, I have to say, after the Global Challenges Research Fund were created, and I'll say a little bit about how that fund works in a minute, but the early signs when it was first created 5 years ago were not good, to be frank. So what we saw very quickly was the research fund created, and then almost immediately Global North scholars based in universities in this country, shooting off emails to scholars in the Global South based in institutions. They're saying, I'm sorry for the rush, but I need your CV by close of business today because I'm putting in for a £1 million grant. And of course, not surprisingly, this raised eyebrows. And it seemed to me almost immediately that there was more harm being caused than good by these rushes to create new relationships in order to apply for significant amounts of grant funding, when we know that relationships of trust are built up over time, and that what is needed is investment of time in working with colleagues closely to build up expertise and relationships. And I was particularly struck, and this is important for a lecture to MLAN, by how little understanding there was, for example, of the role of language in any kind of significant research career. I'm always amazed by how many self-declared Africa experts can't speak an African language in a way that you'd be hard pushed to do if you were studying France or Germany in a long career and managing not to have the language. So to return to the Global Challenges Research Fund then, just to say what it is for those of you who don't know, this is a significant investment of official development assistance, or what we might call aid in research. It was 1.5 billion pounds announced by the UK government in November 2015, and to run over 5 years. And what was striking about this was that aid-funded research on this scale is entirely new for the UK. Gordon works on ODA as I do, and so we saw plans for this coming, but nonetheless, I've been quite struck by how little attention there has been paid to the proposal for this fund and how it's worked subsequently. And it seems to me that GCRF provides an important case study of the UK's changing aid landscape, so that it sits alongside other innovations in the spending and the management of aid. So the way that it came about was that in the spending review and settlement of 2015, it was announced that this new GCRF fund would be created, and it would be dispersed to the UK research councils through their sponsoring ministry, which was then the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, and which subsequently became known as the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And the Global Challenges Research Fund was described as a funding stream of, as I say, £1.5 billion to run over 5 years to ensure, and this is the language that was used, to ensure that UK research takes a leading role in addressing the problems faced by developing countries. The fund would harness the expertise of the UK's research base to pioneer new ways of tackling global challenges, such as in strengthening resilience and response to crises, promoting global prosperity, tackling extreme poverty, and helping the world's most vulnerable. And what's important about this is that this came at the same time as a new government aid strategy in which, again, there was a significant departure for how UK aid would be spent. So for the first time since the creation of the Department for International Development in 1997, that department, DFID, the Department for International Development, would not now be the sole department responsible for disbursing aid. Neither would it be the only government department commissioning and supporting research on development issues. Instead, these aid funds were going to be spread for the first time, and this is true of GCRF, but also of other kinds of funding. Aid would be spread throughout Whitehall, including to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. And I've written quite extensively about this, and on the outline which has been circulated, I suggest if you're wanting to follow up on the way in which GCRF unfolded, that I published a paper in Parliamentary Affairs with Peter Mundler, which you might be interested in. For those of us who know our public law, it seemed this was a really important moment, and that it was strange that lawyers weren't watching it unfold with great interest. And lawyers, I think, have generally neglected to understand the legal framework for UK aid. Because it seems to me that for those of us who know our public law, this new aid strategy in which aid funding would be spread across Whitehall raised a range of interesting issues, because the last time that aid was dispersed in this way was when before DFID was created, when the FCO was responsible for aid. And that led famously to one of the most controversial incidences in the history of British aid, the Pergau Dam affair. For those of you who don't remember it, that case arose when the British government under Margaret Thatcher committed to fund a costly dam in Malaysia in exchange for a major arms deal. Several years and hundreds of millions of pounds later, the High Court ruled that the agreement was unlawful. What had happened was that the Secretary of State for Defence had agreed with the government of Malaysia in 1988 that Britain would provide aid in the amount of 20% of the value of arms sales from Britain to Malaysia, and that aid would come in the form of a dam project. Despite significant assessment from economists and also engineers within what was then the Overseas Development Administration, that the dam wouldn't be a cost-efficient way to increase the production of electricity in Malaysia. Nonetheless, the Foreign Secretary authorised the spending out of the aid budget in order to maintain a deal made by the Defence Secretary and approved by Margaret Thatcher and later by John Major. The World Development Movement called for judicial review of the funding for Pergau Dam on the grounds that a law which is supposed to promote the development or maintain the economy of a country or to promote the welfare of its people was being contravened. And the High Court ruled in 1994 that the project was not of economic benefit to the Malaysian people, that the deal linked aid directly to commercial contracts and was therefore unlawful. And then DFID was created, and we understood that the ministry was meant to create some distance between the work of giving aid and other potential interests, such as the interests that the FCO might have, for example, in promoting British interests in foreign affairs, or that other ministries might be interested in relation to trade, or that ministries might be interested in promoting in relation to what we now hear talk of, in terms of global Britain. And so for the first time here, we see 5 years ago with the creation of, with the new aid strategy, with the creation of a new GCRF, for the first time, aid being used in interesting new ways, some of which were strangely familiar, some not. So for the first time, we see aid being put directly towards research, development research, and that money being put to higher education institutions through the relevant ministry, and coming into higher education institutions in order to promote research in developing countries. And that seemed to me to raise all kinds of really interesting questions about the politics of knowledge production. And I had already returned from East Africa and was actively working with the African Studies Association. And we were talking a lot with colleagues about the likely implications of this fund, and in particular talking about what equitable partnerships might look like in this new landscape, this new funding landscape, and this new aid landscape. And many of us have been writing for many years and interested in the sorts of hierarchies that get created between northern-based and southern-based academics. One amongst those people is Grace Bosila, who some of you might know her scholarship. She's a literary scholar based in South Africa, who's written really perceptively about the fact that even when North-South academic collaborations are significantly invested in active involvement between both partners in knowledge production, there are still all kinds of reasons, infrastructure reasons and resource reasons, why things are heavily skewed in favor of Northern academics, so that there is created what Grace Bosila refers to as a kind of monoliteracy and a preference for really homogenized models of thought, and what she describes as mono-epistemic publishing infrastructures, into which African scholars are forced to fit, both by their involvement in projects which are designed and funded from the global north, but also from their own institutions, where there's enormous pressure to publish in so-called international journals. And the Kenyan Kaguru Macharia recently commented on this in relation to the sorts of funds that are available, by describing how African scholars are always emerging scholars. They're always emerging. To bring this into the present day, and the current context in which we are seeing knowledge produced about the pandemic and about COVID-19, Nanjala Nyabola has recently written really interestingly about the way in which we see in this pandemic the construction of knowledge about Africa. And she argues that the starting point, the premise from which so much of the debate proceeds is partial and is violent. And she argues that even asking the question, why are more Africans not dying from COVID, is to suggest, and she's quite right, that Africans should be dying of COVID in a normative rather than a descriptive sense. I'm quoting her. And she says it exposes the expectation that when the world suffers, Africa must suffer more. And it seems to me that that insight into our current moment says an awful lot about knowledge production more generally, and the inequalities in knowledge production that are baked into many of the ways in which research and scholarship approaches Africa as a continent, and that treats Africa as many of you will know, as one country. And I was reminded by this to revisit Binyavanga Wainaina, who wrote very famously a beautiful essay called How to Write About Africa. If you don't already know it, you should certainly look it up, in which he writes a kind of satire about, if you're writing a book on Africa, how you must do it. You must mention the sunsets. You must start from the premise that Africa is doomed. You must always end your book with Nelson Mandela saying something about rainbows and renaissances. And it's this kind of structural context into which I think these new funds were being inserted. So what do we mean by development research in a context in which relationships are so unequal between those based in the global south and those based in the global north? And I think that we can't get away from the fact that what we're faced with are severely unequal terms and conditions between colleagues based here who have access to the whole infrastructure that allows you to bid for these grants, and the whole infrastructure that allows you, until a few months ago, the mobility that they require, that allows you simply to land in Ethiopia with your grant, and the real experience of stalled mobility that our colleagues and many global south institutions face when they have to, for example, go through the process of applying for visas in what is effectively a hostile, very hostile visa regime. And we know this from our conferences. Any of us who've worked in universities and sought to collaborate with scholars who we want to be mobile between an African country and the UK know the severe difficulties that we're faced with in applying for, in supporting visa applications. And we know the kind of inappropriate language gets talked around this. So we know, for example, I know from my ASA UK work, that there are highly gendered outcomes, for example, so that a woman applying to attend a conference will be told, I'm sorry, we can't allow you to go to the UK on this occasion because your husband is also going to the UK. He's given preference for a visa over her. Or a woman is asked, could you please supply evidence that you have children or that you own property in Kenya that will persuade us that you're going to return home and aren't a flight risk. We all know about those contexts, and it seems to me that those unequal terms and conditions can't be overlooked. And we know that the material conditions under which our colleagues in many global south institutions work are put them at a structural disadvantage. And it seems to me important to keep an eye on how funding such as the Global Challenges Research Fund might worsen that, or might be a chance to improve things, so that we, I think, need to be able to explain what the risks are when you talk the talk of, we're creating equitable relationships, or we must make sure that our project is based on equitable partnerships. But we need to challenge what that means. What is an equitable partnership in a context where you, from a global north institution, are able to be, for example, much more mobile, where you have access to journal publishing, or even access to journals per se, where your global south partners might not. And it seems to me that in order to do this, we need to think carefully about our own roles as gatekeepers, and how it is we go about challenging gatekeepers in the academy in particular, and how we might reinforce rather than contest notions of excellence, for example, in publishing, so that we simply reinforce ideas of where is an excellent place to publish your work, and that we force a continuation of that monoculture in academic terms that Grace Bosila refers to. And on my outline, I provide a couple of references to those of you who want to try and think a little bit more about this. I was very influenced by Curly Katsia's work, in a lecture she gave to the African Literature Association a couple of years ago, in which she talks about our role as editors on journals. And I've thought about this a lot in recent years as I work in various journal roles, that we need to think very hard about the citation practices that we support, who we expect to be cited in given pieces of work. Carly Kutsia points out, you know, when you're writing, when you're reviewing papers in journals relating, for example, to African topics, not to always assume that Foucault is the missing reference. What is our role as journal editors in making sure that we don't police what is and what isn't acceptable in terms of journal publishing and journal standards, and how might we ourselves be complicit in creating an academic monoculture? And so to end, I'm going to suggest a couple of possibilities for our resistance, if you like. So at the same time as we must, of course, be constantly pushing those of us who are able to make sure that funds, international funds meant to do academic work, don't further embed inequalities, and constantly try to push our colleagues to think about what does it mean, what does it really mean to have equitable relationships in very large projects that you're designing and working on. At the same time as doing that, I think we're under an obligation to think historically. So to try and put this current moment of this sort of research being promoted in a historical context, and to think very carefully about what it means for global relationships, and why it's even necessary. Because what funds like this effectively do is make the global north an obligatory point of passage for ideas. Whereas, of course, what we should be thinking hard about is how do we ensure the continuance of what is a long history of South-South conversations. Anybody who knows the history of, for example, the creation of law schools and universities in the immediate post-independence period in Africa will know there are rich intellectual histories there of South-South conversations. In recent times, we know, for example, in relation to the new Kenyan constitution, it's a decade old, we know that the Kenyan constitution drew on the South African constitution, which in its time drew on the Indian one. What we see more and more in our jurisprudence is Kenyan courts drawing on Indian courts and the other way round. Those South-South conversations are really important for us to keep in our minds, because one of the dangers of this kind of new research landscape with which we're faced is that we take for granted that the North is the place where these conversations should be promoted and are being promoted. And I think a little bit of epistemic modesty in that regard is incredibly important. So the promotion of South-South conversations and ideas, the support of those who've been doing that sort of work for many a long year. So the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, many of you will know, CODISRIA, simply doesn't pass through London or Cardiff or Edinburgh in its conversations. Those places and those debates are irrelevant to it. And it seems to me that it's precisely that should be our starting point. And I cite in the outline, you'll see Dipesh Chakrabarty and his scholarship on the idea of provincializing Europe. And I think part of what we should be doing is precisely to provincialize Europe and to think about whether our center of gravity is indeed the global north. I've been really struck this morning by the number of people saying, while the world's distracted by the American elections, and I'm thinking to myself, well, is the world distracted by the American elections? I mean, that might be if your center of gravity is the US or even Europe, but there are many of us who are following very closely what's happening in Ethiopia or what's happening in Uganda or in Tanzania in relation to elections and opposition leaders. And so I suppose I would end by saying the great Southern African scholar Sam Moyo talked a lot about Africa's epistemic sovereignty. And I think I would want to hold on to that idea and to say that despite the temptations of this changing landscape, and we know that funds like GCRF are going to continue for quite some time, that it is on the agenda, those of us who can should be thinking about what other models there are for the generation of ideas, the generation of intellectual work, and our role as scholars in supporting that. And Gordon, I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Ambreena, for a brilliant talk. Really stunning ideas and very enlightening. We've only actually had one Q&A question I've found, which we've answered, which was about the recording of this. So I'm going to open the floor to any participants who want to ask
Gordon,
a question.
That's the question about the recording is a panelist question. So for anyone that's attending the webinar, just to remind you that the recording of this session will be available on the YouTube channel of the school at a later date.
Excellent, thank you, Elena. So we can open the floor. You can ask to unmute, I think, and then we can unmute you, or you can write your question in the Q&A box. And maybe whilst we're waiting, I'm not seeing anybody asking a question just yet. So maybe I should ask a question, Ambreena, if that's okay. One of the things, I mean, I was going to make a comment actually on, as well as knowledge and universities and African studies, there's also the practice of development and so on. And when we look at the practice of development, we see a very similar phenomenon. If you think about the way in which the Western countries such as Britain and others give money to African countries, it's all conditional, and the conditions are very much that you will follow the model that we have. And good example of that would be global budgetary assistance, which is given to places like Rwanda and Uganda, which are, of course, following the neoliberal economic model. And other examples are just simply the governance model. We know how to govern, therefore you should follow that. I'm just making a couple of reflections here actually, but I'm also wondering about the shape of the world as it develops, because we have the BRIC economies, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as well. And they are, of course, like scholars referred to as emerging economies, not as developed economies as well. And I suspect that there will be more scope for South-South cooperation with the emergence of these with these superpowers, really, in some ways. And I don't know how, whether we can somehow tap into that or help in any way with that. But I suppose my question as well is, what do you think of the was driving the emergence of the Global Challenges Research Fund? Do you think that the government, the British government, had really positive intentions in mind, that they had thought this through, or was their agenda more about value for money in the aid program, satisfying the right-wing press? You know, to what extent do you think that they had actually thought through the whole GCRF agenda before launching a 1.5 billion pound fund. I mean, I guess they hadn't thought through the South-South implications of it, but what do you think was behind it?
So I think a couple of things were behind it. One is, I think we know the 0.7 aid target around that time. So there was going to be a significant aid budget, now ring-fenced, which they were legally obliged to spend because of the Target Act of 2015. This was one way to spend it. Spread it around Whitehall. Don't just give it to one responsible ministry. So, you know, we're very interested because we're in universities that it was given to Bayes, but of course it was given to a lot of other people too, right? So there's that. But I also think that they used it, and this is something that we've written about, they used it partly to plug a funding gap in relation to higher education, for example, or research coming into universities, that they were simply able to take money out of that budget and put it into research spending so that it looked as if there was a reasonably healthy spend. And I think what the consequence of that was that there was a lot of rush at the beginning. I think this is less true now. I think there's much more careful thought. And actually, I've seen in recent months really good examples of really carefully thought out projects, people coming forward who have had long-standing relationships with colleagues and are able to really co-formulate proposals and get funding for really very excellent, thoughtful work. But certainly at the start, there was this mad rush to put bids in. And I think things were less well thought out, and certainly difficult questions weren't being asked of applicants about what are you doing to ensure that your project is focusing on equitable partnerships and focusing on co-production of research. And as time has gone on and the kind of this fund has become embedded, I think there's much more careful work going on, particularly by the funding councils, to ask those sorts of questions and to then make sure that funding panels also ask those questions about, you know, does this proposal stand up? Is the applicant really showing that the idea was co-produced, that the work that comes out of it will be written up together, that pieces that articles will be co-published in the true sense of the word, or, you know, where you see an application where it's so obvious what's really going on here is just, you know, ideas mining. You know, you have a panel that knows enough to know, you know, we can't allow this kind of stuff to be supported and funded. Because as I say, and I think this is, and I saw the evidence of this in the early stages, the potential for this kind of funding to really do harm, to really spoil relationships where, you know, many of us have worked for many, many years to develop really close relationships in relation to our research work. I think in recent years there's been an improvement. But to answer your question, I think what was going on there was, let's create the fund and then let's kind of simply see how it works out. And I suppose the good news is it's worked better in the last few years than it did right at the start.
Thank you, Ambreena. I see that we've got 4 questions now. So Elena, do you want to ask David's question and I'll move on to the next one? Elena, you're on.
Thank you. Okay, so David first thanks you for an excellent talk, and he says it confirms some of my concerns about GCRF and colleagues' responses to it. How can we develop more collaborative approaches to using this kind of funding? And obviously relationships need to be built long-term, but is there more to it than that?
I think the relationships do have to be built long-term, and there's no shortcut for that. It simply is about investing time and thinking about what is and what isn't strictly necessary in an application as well. I mean, we know now that all of our mobility has been so severely stalled that, you know, much of what we thought was necessary in order to do good work really isn't. that actually, you know, we can connect very easily remotely, that we can have virtual conversations, that we don't actually have to be flying in and out of places. And in some ways, there's been something, I think, really interesting about the way in which having to you know, meet in this kind of format has actually been good for equitable relationships. You know, people can Zoom in. I've been in talks over the summer, you know, in which people are able to join from Brazil and from Delhi and from Dar es Salaam. Things that we've never done before, we're now able to do. So in a way, there's no excuse for not building the equitable partnerships and relationships and co-producing the work and thinking about proposals carefully. We know now that that's possible, and I hope that funders are more careful about the sorts of work that gets funded, so that what you're looking really carefully for good equitable partnerships, and you're looking for outcomes that are equitable, that you're not, you know, forcing people to publish the outcomes of their research in Global North journals, which are behind a paywall.
I think that's absolutely right. I agree entirely with that. We've actually, I'm going to read another question, and then Elena, you can read the question from Christina, and then I will read the comment from Lillian, which has come in on the chat. But we'll start with Farida's question. A great talk, as always, says Farida. I was wondering if you could say something about the intra-regional inequalities manifested in the dominance and privileging generally and in the partnerships with mainly South African institutions, especially former white institutions like UCT.
It's a really good point. Thanks, Frida. It's an excellent point. So Grace Bosila says this, that, you know, in some regards, South Africa is the North in the South. And the way in which it skews things is interesting. Partly, you know, its scholars have greater funding, again, of course, depending on which institution they're in. But there's also a real tendency, and you'll know this, for South Africa to be the easy go-to partner, because the research infrastructure is there and the models are there to work with. And it's actually much more difficult to go to, for example, a Kenyan university, but one that's outside the usual suspects in Nairobi, to work elsewhere in say, Ethiopia or in Tanzania. So I think that's absolutely right to be aware of that. That there is a kind of a lumpy context as well when we talk about global South institutions and their ability to support research, and that really is about research infrastructure and about, you know, we know the kind of the difficulties also of, you know, kind of research hierarchies, for example, based on age and gender, in which, you know, it's expected that you know, older professors will be put in on bids, and where it makes real difficulties for younger colleagues if they're the ones included in projects, or where women are particularly disadvantaged because their male head of department won't release them in order to do significant work on a project. We know about those things, and you're quite right to be aware of those subtleties and those shifting contexts as well, and that's about having the close relationships and the close conversations as well.
Want to read out the question, Elena? Do you want to
yes,
read out
Christina Marinetti says, thanks, Ambreena. So wonderful to hear you speak so passionately and honestly about the important work you do. What do you say about the inequalities of knowledge production and Grace Bosila's work on monoliteracy? Thank you for pointing us to her work, by the way. Resonates much with discussions in translation studies. We have been very concerned with the silencing of different epistemologies of knowledge, which emerge when scholarship is produced and circulated in different languages. We sometimes call this epistemicide. In the journal I am involved in, Target, we give contributors the chance to submit their articles in different languages and then have them translated. Is this something you could see as a possible tool that could be factored in to help redress the balance between North and South when it comes to publications in African area studies?
It's a great question. Thank you, Christine. That's why I'm so excited to give this talk to an MLang audience, because it seems to me that it's precisely those conversations across disciplines that we absolutely need to have if we're going to try and think about ways of confronting this kind of closing down or provincializing of conversations. So a couple of things in relation to language and translation. I've been in events in the last few months where for the first time the practice which Codisria has always had of simultaneous interpretation has just become standard. So Codisria always has, I was teaching there a couple of years ago, you teach a summer school there and all the classes are simultaneously translated. So every class is taken by a French speaker and an English speaker together. And there's interpreters with you in every class, 2 interpreters with you in every class. That's Codisria's standard practice. It's always done that. It always publishes its work at least bilingually, so it's bulletin and journal. And it does that precisely in order to promote Pan-African conversations and academic scholarship. And in the summer, I was at events where, for the first time, and this is again one of the things about being online, events about the Kenyan constitution were simultaneously interpreted into Kiswahili. So you could go either to the Kiswahili session or you could go and listen in English. Similarly, events in which Brazilian colleagues, Indian colleagues based in Africa get together. Those kinds of Pan-Africanist or global South things are going on. It's just a matter of looking for them. And those events are completely committed to getting over the barriers of language, confronting them head on. So recently, there's a newspaper published out of South Africa, the Mail and Guardian publisher, a free online newspaper on the weekend called The Continent. And for the first time last weekend, that was published in 10 different African languages. So those conversations are happening. And again, it's a reason for me to revisit the history of some of these debates, because these were precisely the discussions that were happening on Dar es Salaam campus after independence in the 60s about how do we promote not just interdisciplinary scholarship, but scholarship, Pan-African scholarship across different language barriers, and how do we bring those conversations together?
Thank you, Ambreena. Elena, I think I'll read the comment from Lillian, and then you can ask the question from Joey, if that's okay. So Lillian has made more of a comment, really. There are numerous GCRF funded projects within institutions. However, few, if any, showcase the project from the Southern viewpoint or give the emerging researcher, in inverted commas, the same level of appreciation or value of their contributions. This needs to be addressed, and I don't think panelists are willing to do the work to ask further and deeper questions about the supposed relationship. I suppose that confirms what you've already said. Did you want to add anything on that, Ambreena? I
mean, I think that was very true at the start, and I think because sometimes with funding calls as well, they were so short and so rushed that relationships were created in kind of unseemly haste. And you could tell that if you were assessing applications, but there wasn't a great deal that you could do to change that. But I think the funders responsible for these grants have become much more astute at asking the questions about, is this a meaningful, equal relationship? Have the ideas been created together? Has the whole proposal, have all the ideas been discussed and work through together, and will this be a relationship which looks like it's based on equity and on long-standing trust? I think that's improved a lot in the last 3 years. I've seen real improvements, partly because there's been a lot of pushback from assessors and panelists who very astutely will pick up, this is made up. This, and look, there's a kind of value for money issue here, in that those kinds of projects often just don't actually do very well. in truth, that's the way to persuade the funder that it's not worth investing in, because those projects often are the ones that work least well and that have the least outcomes in terms of good research that's publishable and so on. Good long-standing relationships are also a good way to produce excellent research, and I think the funders see that more and more.
That's excellent. Thank you, Elena.
Yes, Joe Whitfield says, more of a comment. I currently have an AHRC grant in which, working with Mexican partners, we have tried to make it work for our partners and are paying them through it, but I'm embarrassed to let them see the overall budget because the amounts covering our salaries and our overheads for the UK universities are crazily high compared to how much we are managing to funnel to them. Despite the participation as co-creators, the lack of transparency from us about the money is a real issue. Any tips?
I really don't know how we get over that, because it's a real problem that it's a structural problem, that no matter what, the funding is skewed towards northern-based researchers and their salaries and their buyout and so on. And I really don't know how you get over that, because of the way that the funds are structured. The whole architecture favors the global north. It's from the global north. It's written in the interests of the global north, so that buyout happens according to how our model of buyout works. Salaries are paid according to how our model of salaries, buyout works, with very little attention actually to what might be useful for a global south scholar in terms of participating in the project. It's written entirely from the standpoint of a global north scholar. Who is the person who applies? Who is the person who holds the grants here? And I can only sympathize with you. I know precisely what you mean about not wanting to show how skewed that is. But that doesn't mean it's not known. People realize, our colleagues realize that this skewing takes place. And I think it is a real problem, and it's one of the things that I think puts a lot of people off these grants. In some ways, it's incredibly freeing not to have them, because you don't have those concerns and worries, and actually you realize you can do an awful lot of very good work without huge amounts of money.
Excellent, thank you. And Elena's telling we have a raised hand. Can you unmute, Elena? You're very good at these things. Thank you. Evelina, I think you're on mute. Have we unmuted Evelina? Let's see attendees. Hang on, see if I can do this. Evelina, see. Oh, we're getting the hang of this. Sorry, Ramos, it's down, it's coming up in. Yeah, I can unmute, sorry. Let's see, asked to unmute, sorry about this. I think I'm asking you, Evelina, to unmute. I'm pressing the button. Are you unmuted now? Can you try and speaking, Evelina? You look as though you're still on mute. No. No, I don't think we can hear you actually.
Maybe just give it a moment, Gordon, and see if that works for a second.
Okay, that's it. Evelina? We should be able to hear you now. No, are you? No, we can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I think Evelina would rather ask the question by the chat.
Okay, that's fine, and that's okay. Let's have your question by chat, Evelina. Okay. Coming in via the chat box now. We're trying to do it via the other one, but that's okay. Oh, raise your hand by mistake.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, Elena, that's fine. So does anybody have any last questions? I could ask a question, but I'd rather somebody else got a chance to ask a question. Anybody? wish to scribble something down very quickly in the remaining minute and a half? No? Okay, so I just one thing I wanted to ask actually was, I was watching Richard Dowden, who's quite he wrote for the Independent and various other newspapers, and his definition was of the colonization process. One of the impacts of colonization was that it created a lack of confidence in Africa. It took away some of the self-confidence. So what I'm wondering about is this GCRF potentially having a similar negative impact if it's handled badly. How, coming back to David's question, how should we be going about? If you have a partnership, how should you approach it? How should you go about putting together a bid with an African partner?
I think the starting point for me would be not to assume that I was a great priority. I think it would be about epistemic modesty and about understanding that I am only one tiny part of a Global South-based scholar's intellectual work and world, so that I think it's about turning the lens and realizing that we are privileged to be allowed to work, and for our colleagues in the Global South to make time to work with us. And I think that's what's wrong with a lot of approaches I see, is that, the starting point is, aren't you lucky I picked you? We know that Global South scholars are busy with their own individual intellectual projects, but we also know that they are in conversation with their colleagues in other Global South parts of the world. So this kind of provincialism that we suffer from in this country isn't true of other people. That Indians sitting with Brazilians are sitting with Africans, right? We shouldn't assume our provincialism applies to them, but also that, for example, African scholars are often so closely involved in social movements, in activism, that their whole identity is not simply as an academic. Again, we valorize this when actually many African academics are also doing great activist work on all kinds of issues, social, reproductive rights to constitutional law, to working in urban settlements. All of this kind of stuff goes on, and their connection with social movements, for example, is so admirable. When I sit and listen to those conversations, I find there's a whole kind of richness that I think we're very privileged to get any insight into. And I think if we start from that point of view, and we understand and respect other people's epistemic sovereignty, that's not a bad starting point.
That's an absolutely superb answer. I think that we have used up our allotted hour, as in very kind of Eurocentric fashion. And I would like to say a huge thanks to you, Ambreena, as ever, for being a brilliant speaker. I also want to say thanks to my co-host, Elena, many, many thanks, and to Lael for setting this up so professionally, and to everybody for attending at such a busy time in the term. Thank you so much. We are actually working on our schedule, our program, mainly for the second semester, but you will be informed. We will keep you informed of all the subsequent events, and we are extremely grateful. And now my job is to stop this recording, so wish me luck, okay? Thank you so much, Ambreena. Everybody's free.
All the best, Gordon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elena.